I think it should now be recording. Yes. Okay, so the guidelines from the ERS state that high-speed video analysis, including serial bit frequency and bit pattern analysis, should be used as a part of the diagnosis for PCD. It's a weak recommendation because alone it's not enough to say anything about diagnosis, but it's a good indication. And it's also strongly recommend that after this assessment, the analysis should be repeated after culture to make sure that any kind of defects that are seen are not secondary and are actually genetic primary disease. So here I think that the main interest of the high-speed video microscopy is to give a quick assessment while you will be waiting for either electronic microscopy or genetic testing that can take several months, while you will have an assessment of the serial bit pattern in a couple of hours after the patient visits. So it's important to show that the ATS is actually not recommending currently high-speed video microscopy as a tool for PCD diagnosis, but they say it should not be used to replace TEM or to replace PCD gene testing. Well, I don't think that's what we want to do. We just say that it's complementary. And so both ERS and ATS agree that CBF alone should not be part of the diagnostic. And I think that we will see example of that later. And so this newest paper from now 2 years ago from Bruna Robo and Amelia Schumacher shows that, in fact, high-speed video microscopy have an excellent sensitivity and specificity to diagnose PCD. And so I think it just shows that in the future, both ERS and hopefully ATS should be able to recommend high-speed video microscopy analysis as a tool for diagnosis. So to understand how high-speed video microscopy analysis work, we first have to understand how cilia is beating and what is a normal beating. So I put here a couple of examples of published schematic of waveform. So one of my favorite and one of the oldest one that I wear is from the 80s, where they describe ciliary bit beating pattern using, I believe it's rabbit epithelium. And we have now a more accurate description, but it's pretty much important to remember that we have an active stroke where the cilium push the mucus layer, and a recovery stroke here in red where the cilium get back in position. And so a cilium should be 5-7 micron long, less than microns of diameter, and the ciliary bit frequency has been described from 7 to 16 hertz. So it's really hard to get actual real references. I would say, to my experience, 13 to 15 hertz at 37 degrees seems to be the normal ciliary bit frequency. So to record, there is obviously a lot of commercial options. I decided to just go through my actual setup at the University of Dundee, which was pretty close actually to the setup I had either in France or in the US. So we have a microscope, which is an inverted microscope. We use a 63x all immersion objective. People have been describing cilia bit patterns through 40x, 63x, or even 100x. Usually the 63x is the best compromise between magnification and the amount of light you need to perform the analysis. So 37 degrees is important, and I will get back to that later. And so we use a high-speed camera. So ours is a AOS U1000. We record at 500 frames per second for a total of 1,000 frames. I think people have been describing as low as 120 hertz. I believe it's a bit slow for a perfect description. In Paris, I was doing 350. I think with the newest camera, 500 frames per second is a good compromise. And so my window is 752 by 752 currently, which gave me a description of 0.7 microns. So it's still pretty accurate in terms of pixel size. And so the way we do the analysis is to look at cells in suspension. So either directly from a brushing or scrapped from the culture. And so the protocol says that we should record at least 10 ciliated strips of continuous and non-disrupted epithelium, consisted at least 6 cells per strip. So I will get back to that in a minute. And ideally, if you don't find enough ciliated cells, you could go back to your brushing and prepare a new slide. So the way we do it is actually by going through the whole chamber and finding the ciliated strip and recording them. And so in my 10 video, we usually do at least 8 side views that I will show and 2 top views. And so it allows us to describe and have a good understanding of the ciliary beat pattern. Obviously, there is a lot of different angles that the cilia can be beating. So if it's beating toward or away from the observer, it's usually not required because it's harder to guess any kind of pattern. So when we were saying about normal epithelium, we have to go back to this paper published in 2009, which describe what are the consequences of recording disrupted epithelium. So a normal H will be here in A, and then we'll have like minor disruption, major disruption, isolated cells on somewhat minor disruption, and then single cells. The worst you could do is to record single cells because that's where the ciliary pattern will be potentially the most affected by the state of the cells. So I just wanted to show you some example of what I would consider good videos with almost no disruption of the epithelium. We can see here the side views, and we can actually almost follow the cilium during the whole beating, either on this one or on this one. And this is the top view. So the whole edge is slightly vibrating, but we can definitely follow the cilium tip during the whole cycle, which also allow us to describe it and see this forward recovery fashion. So before going further, I said that we are recording at 37 degrees, and I think it's really important because we know that the temperature have an effect on cilia beating. So the most known effect is the effect on ciliary beat frequency, where we can see that under 31, 32 degrees, the ciliary beat frequency start to highly decrease. And so if you were to record at room temperature between 20 and 25 degrees, you already have your ciliary beat frequency that is almost divided by 2. The problem is that we don't know if the pattern remains the same when you decrease your beat frequency. And I think the answer is no. We have this letter that was published a couple years ago by the Southampton team that shows that for certain genetic mutation in PCD, if you were to record at low frequency, at low temperature, you would, by reducing the frequency, actually modify the beat pattern, and so see a normal beat pattern that is only normal because it's actually affected by temperature. So I think 37 is really important. There is several ways to put your sample at 37. You can have like a whole chamber. You can have a heated plate. So I think it's something worth investing. And so now that you have recorded your video, the question is, how do you analyze? What can you say about the ciliary beat pattern? And so there is this, I would say, famous paper from Mark Shilvers, I think it's 2003, which describe 4 types of beating, where the normal beating showing the forward and recovery stroke pattern is described here. And then we have a virtually immotile / not beating at all pattern B, and then C was described as stiff. Stiff as in the cilia is bedding less, and so the amplitude, the distance traveled by the tip is reduced. And then we have the D, the rotational, the circular motion, where the tip seems to describe almost a circle. And in this paper, they highlighted that the immotile cilia were most of the time associated with inner and outer dining arm defect, which would make sense because if you are missing both dining arm, you don't have any motor to move your cilia, and so your cilia is not moving. Outer dining arm as well would be associated with immotile cilia, while inner dining arm, which at the time we didn't know, but it's most of the time associated with microtubule defect as well. So it's slightly more complicated than just inner dining arm, but as long as radial spoke will be associated with stiff, so reduced amplitude, and the rotational motion here is associated to transposition defect, which are the central pair defects. And so this study was also repeated by Sylvain Blanchon a couple years ago. And it's interesting to see that 100% here of the dining outer and inner dining arm were immotile. Almost whole of the outer dining arm were immotile. But then you can see the spread of pattern for the other type of genetic mutation, where the majority of reduced amplitude were actually not found in the inner dining arm, but in the central pair defect. But the circular motion was almost only found in the central pair defect, which will show that if you have a central pair defect, you don't always show a circular motion, but if you have a circular motion, you probably have a circular defect. So that's it for the description of pattern. And so then we can actually look at quantifying the ciliary bit. And so the easiest and most known parameter is the ciliary bit frequency. So obviously the first way to do it will be just to play the video frame by frame, count how many times your cilia get back to the position. And by doing that, you know the period and you can invert it and find the frequency. So that will be the manual approach. There is now a mathematical approach that allows it to do it automatically or at least semi-automatically. So one of them is fast Fourier transform. So I will not try to get you to learn the physics behind, but just be aware that when you have a periodic signal, it can be seen as a sum of simple periodic signal, and all those periodic signal will be described by one frequency. And so if you were to look at the level of gray, for example, which is varying over time, well, when the cilia is showing, it's really dark. When the cilia is not showing, it's lighter. And so you could actually look at the time variation of this pixel of gray. And if you are about to do the frequency on it, well, you will find that one frequency seems to show up. And luckily, this is a ciliary bit frequency, this the frequency at which the cilia is beating. Obviously, when you do it on the full image like that, you expose yourself to a lot of noise because this whole area where there is no cilia should be zero. This whole area is still moving, maybe with a smaller frequency because the whole edge is moving, or maybe you can see other cilia through the cells. So another way to do it is actually to look at a line that is going through the cilia, and you can actually do, again, the FFT on it, which gives you a frequency that you can trust a little bit more. But another way to do it is actually to look at this line and stack it over time, and we now see this cilia going in and out of the line over time, and manually you can measure how many cycles you have in 1 second, and by doing that you also find a ciliary bit frequency. So the way it was done in this paper from 2012, on which my whole analysis in Dundee is based, is actually to do 1, 2, and 3 measurements. And by doing those 3 measurements, we then make sure that this is always accurate. And so if some of you heard about the SAVA method, so the Simpson-Ammons video analysis, it's actually based on FFT, where I actually here find picture in the article, and it shows that you can do a single point analysis, which will be the same ideas and the line I presented earlier, or you can do the whole image analysis, where hopefully where there is no cilia, it will be 0, and where there is cilia, it will be a frequency that is a ciliary beat frequency. So those models are available online, or it can be, I would say, pretty easily written on any kind of programmation software. Mine is in MATLAB, but you could do Python, for example, if you wanted a free software. And so there's a couple papers that actually look at PCD mutation and ciliary beat frequency. This paper here from Joanna Reid in Germany actually had a couple of different gene mutation and the associated frequency. So as you can see, the number of subjects was low to very low. But we can see that DNH11 here, which is a normal electronic microscopy mutation, seems to be kind of like singled out with a higher frequency compared to inner DNA arm, which virtually immotile, so have virtually a zero frequency. And to go even further in the analysis of cilia, we can now find quantitative analysis of ciliary beat pattern. So the first one is this one from 2012 from the French team where I did my thesis, so Jean-François Papon, Bruno Louis. And so the idea is now when you look at your cilia beating, you can describe the position of the base and the position of the tip at the start and at the end of your active stroke, or by opposition, the start and end of your recovery stroke. And those 3 points here will get you a triangle, and this triangle through simple trigonometry can get you a bunch of parameters. So the cilium length, the angle described during the beating, the amplitude, which is the distance between the 2 points. Of course, the ciliary beat frequency was already measured, and we can do it again here. And so one of the parameters that was interesting was the amplitude per second, so the distance traveled by the tip multiplied by the frequency. So in the original papers, they also look at the exact time where the active stroke starts, the exact time where it stops, and the time of which little pause that you have between the start of the recovery stroke and the start of the next active stroke, etc. So it was 3 point and 5 time points. I do not get the 5 point in Dundee, but be aware that you can get even more parameter with this type of analysis. And so the result of this paper showed that ciliary beat frequency, but also the angle or the distance traveled per second were parameters that were showing a difference between non-PCD and PCD patients. And the distance traveled per second weighted by the percentage of beating cilia was a better parameter to classify unconclusive diagnostic between non-PCD and PCD. And I think it's a point that I should even have raised earlier. But here, when we look at beating cilia, we are biased on the microscope to look at beating cilia. And so it's important to record and have in mind that if only 10% of your cilia are beating in a sample, even if they are beating perfectly, only 10% of the cilia are beating. And so for the overall phenotype of the patient and the overall explanation of his disease, you need to find a way to track this measurement. And so that's what he was doing here by weighting the parameter. Then some people in the US from with Cecilia Lowe and Chakra Shenubotla. I'm sorry, I met him several times, and every single time it's hard to say his name. Try to look at automatic way to describe cilia, and they find 4 different type of beating. And so in this example, they display here normal beating, and they display here PCD, so dyskinetic and incomplete beating. It was an interesting paper. I'm still looking for it to go a little bit further, but I think in 2015 it was really novel, and I'm looking forward to see where it leads. Then we can even see more description of the waveform. So here it's a paper from Alina Oltean in Washington University, where I did my postdoc, where they actually track the position of the cilia at every single time to reconstruct the whole waveform. And from this whole waveform, the same way we were doing it on Chlamydomonas, so algae cells cilia, you can actually extract physical parameters. So here, they look at how cilia are growing in culture, and we can see that in early days, so in culture, from 0 to 2 months, the cilia are growing, and the frequency is slowly increasing. And you can see here the same way we describe the effect of length on Chlamydomonas cilia, how the waveform actually appear from something really stiff to somewhat a normal shape. So it's a really interesting paper, and then they look at where some of the innervating arms that are proximal or distal actually go, and I don't go too further in the paper, but there is actually now a really good description of cilia waveform. And so if we go back to the paper that I presented earlier from Sylvain Blanchon, where he was looking at the different type of pattern associated to the different type of genotype, he actually applies the same idea of the Papon analysis with the 3-point and 5 time points. And he was able to show that depending of your genotype, you may or may not have different type of cilia beat parameters. So in this analysis, the inner and outer linear mutation have been removed, because since they are always non-moving, all parameter would be 0 at all time, or infinite, I guess. But here we can see that we can already see a sort of trend where outer linear arm are somewhat really slow, and then inner linear arm and central pair defect will be somewhat in the middle, and the normal electronic microscopy, so the cilia mutation that seems to have no effect on the ultrastructure, seems to have somewhat of a normal frequency. And it's also the same with angle, where it seems that the inner linear arm defect actually affect the pattern more than enough that any other type of mutation. And if you look at the distance per second, well, it's pretty much a product of the bit frequency of the angle. We can see that here, once again, outer and inner linear are the worst, CC is somewhat in the middle, and the normal electronic microscopy seems to have somewhat of a normal parameters. And so we can explain this idea of normal electronic microscopy having somewhat of a normal frequency by the late work of Ciccioli in Peter Kikuta lab in Cambridge, where they also describe the waveform over time. And we can see here that both IDIN and DNH11, which are associated with normal ultrastructure, and sometimes even a higher frequency than normal, were associated with this really reduced amplitude. And by reducing the amplitude, you actually allow the cilia to beat faster, because the distance reducing you can have at the same velocity and higher frequency. So that's pretty much the highlights of waveform paper. So I hope I convince you that looking at the cilia for PCD diagnosis and for PCD research is important. And so now I would like to switch to the next part, which is showing a couple of examples of different type of PCD patients. And so if you want to take guess in the chat and guess if they are normal, or if they are not normal, guess what could happen, you are more than welcome. So the first one here, we can see 4 side views and a top views. I will let people a couple seconds to have a look at it and try to make an idea of what they think. You guys around, what do you think? Normal PCD, looking weird, looking normal? Okay. Yeah, as soon as one person say normal, then everybody will say normal in the chat. So it's actually a patient that we classify as non-PCD. His parameter actually looks normal, so I would agree with the chat. This is normal, and even Amelia agrees, so that's good. Yeah, exactly. So next one, it will get harder and harder with time. What do you think of this patient? Exactly. So I won't let people answer in the chat. This is pretty obvious. This is not moving. And I promise you, this is video. You might see it flickering a little. So this patient actually had both inner and outer leaning arm that were missing on TEM. And so pretty obvious phenotype, no need of super fancy analysis. This is probably PCD. Okay, next patient. So it's a little bit trickier. It's actually not completely immotile. I can highlight some area where it's slightly moving. We have some slight movement here. We can see here that it's missing, some cells are missing actually completely cilia. So once again, no real question here. This is not normal. So this patient actually had a CCDC39 mutation, which give you inner leaning arm and microtubule defects. Maybe the cilia are a bit shorter. I do think that those one definitely looks longer than this one, for example. So there's probably some of them that are shorter as well, I agree. Okay, next one. So once again, I promise you this is a video. And so here, interestingly, it's an outer leaning arm defect. And so I think here it's like the analysis is really quick. It's not beating, so looks pretty PCD to me. Okay, next video, slightly tricky. So it's moving around here. I don't know if you can see, it's moving around here. It's slightly moving around here and it's pretty slow. It's slightly moving around here. So obviously this is not normal. It's slightly hard to see, but we can guess some kind of rotational pattern, I believe in this video when you are used to see it. And so rotational pattern probably means central pair defect. And there is actually really pretty TEM that suggests exactly that. So this patient was a central pair defect. Okay, next one. There's 11 total, so bear with me. So here we now see some movement. It's really blurry in there. I don't know if anyone want to answer on the chat. Take a guess. What's wrong? Is it right? Reduce. Stiff. Yeah, it's as soon as someone says something, everybody will say the same. So yeah, I agree that this look slightly reduced around here. This looks somewhat normal actually. And here it's a little bit blurry, but we also see some kind of rotational pattern. And so it's actually also a central pair defect. So let's go into slightly harder. So what do you think of this patient? Peter says stiff. Okay. Anyone in the room? What do you think, guys? Looks all right. Okay. Looks all right-ish. Okay. Not too strong of an opinion here. Okay, so it's actually it's a reduced amplitude for most of them. We can see it here that it looks somewhat what they call stiff, so reduced amplitude. So this is an interesting case because this patient have a ED mutation, which means that it's a normal electronic microscopy. So that's where high-speed video microscopy can give an ID saying, well, this looks reduced, it doesn't look normal. You go 2 months later, you get your TEM result and it looks normal. So you don't really know what to do. You have to wait until your genetic get back. And so it may take another 2 months. And so I think that's where high-speed video microscopy gives you an edge, because you could start some kind of treatment for the patient, waiting for the result to be actually confirmed. Okay, next one. Any ID? Someone says stay, Steve, reduce amplitude. Yeah, so this is also pretty reduced. And if we look at this area, it also looks really fast. And I think it's actually fair to think that, because it was a DNH11 mutation, which is a mutation that we talked about earlier in the letter, saying that they are somewhat of a high frequency, reduced amplitude, and you would lose that pattern if you were to look at it at too cold of temperature. So a little bit trickier again. I'm sorry, it's a bit blurry. Can you see here that something is not exactly right? It's not exactly about the pattern. It's a little more subtle than that. So it's actually slightly staggered. The beating is somewhat normal, but it seems to have like a really long pause and then kind of rush into his forward motion. And so this patient is a CDCC 164 DRC1, which is a dining regulatory complex. And so TM showed microtubular disorganization, and it's kind of subtle treatment, and it can be associated with nexting link. Okay, 2 more. Oop, my bad. Okay, I'm sorry, it's a lot of videos. Come on. Okay, this one. I gave you an easier one now. Can you see what's wrong? Anyone see what's wrong in here? I lose everyone. No one is answering the chat anymore. Yes. Thank you, I guess, Eva, for pointing out. It's actually rotating. We see rotation here. We can get the rotational on the side view. It's a bit harder, but if you were to follow one cilia, look at this area here, how the cilia keep coming out and of focus. So this is exactly a pretty example of so many cilia rotating in one sample. And so this patient actually has the RSPH9 mutation. And so last one, do you see anything that someone looks weird, or do you think it's normal? Okay, so I will answer myself. So it's actually a little tricky one, because this is once again a DRC patient, and so the beating patterns look somewhat normal, but we can see some pause and stagger movement. And if you look here, it seems that every other beat is smaller than the other one. You see, it's like you do a normal beat, then you barely come back, and then you do a normal beat. And so Claire Jackson told me that it was actually seen by 3 different people in Southampton. And when they did culture, most cilia actually just stopped beating. So once again, DRC1, dining regulation complex 1. So as you can see, high-speed video microscopy can give you an idea of what's wrong with the patient, or sometimes what's actually not wrong. And it's also help for, I would say, non-obvious phenotype, because if you look at your cilia and they are not moving, it's a pretty obvious phenotype. And so it probably will help you to guide the TEM, what are you looking for? Or it may also help you guide the genetic testing. You know, if they are not moving, probably look into dining arm. If they are doing rotational movement, look at central parent defect. So with that, I will just stop sharing video to everybody. So I will thanks all supervisor and mentors that I have had over my, oh, I don't want to count, 7-8 years of research in cilia. So from France, from the US, currently I'm working with Professor James Chalmers, which I can see across the room, and Amelia, who was just entering in the chat. So I will also thanks all collaborator colleagues for help, support, anything else, sharing chocolate at work, it's important. And of course, all patients for participation in studies, because we can't do research without patients. And so I will thank Claire Jackson at the University of Southampton and Amelia again for sharing video from the Royal Brompton. I will also thank the chair of BEAT-PCD. So Amelia, again, I told her she's 3 times in the slide, and Miro Nagutaki in Bern. So I put back here information about PCD. If you have any question, please email, please go on Twitter. They will answer you. I will also acknowledge the UK Cilia Network, which is doing a good job here in the UK to put people together and think about cilia. And with that, I will take questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Mathieu. It was very clear presentation and examples of reduced diff and normal beating patterns. We have the first question from Ayed. He asks, how does the angle of view dictate the output from the FFT calculation, and does the angle not matter in this case?
So I would say that normally ciliary bit frequency analysis is pretty reliable, because you can do it from top view, you can do it from side view, you can do it somewhat in the middle. You are really looking at something that is coming in and out of focus, and which have an effect on the level of gray. So I think in that matter, any kind of video, even with a smaller magnification that you would expect for get actual real ciliary bit pattern parameter, you would be able to get any kind of ciliary bit frequency. Once again, both ERS and ETS agreed this is not the main parameter, and it can't be taken alone as a diagnosis.
And 2 more follow-up questions from Ayed as well. Is there more data to suggest that velocity might be more sensitive when compared to CBF?
I mean, I'm aware of, you know, like the work that was done in France. I'm aware of a couple of papers that I talk about in my presentation. I think there is a lot of talk about how pattern, like even like a qualitative description of pattern, is somewhat better than just CBF alone. I don't know if you know, velocity is better than CBF, but I think if you're able to get the velocity, you then take into account both the pattern and the CBF, and by combining both, you probably have something that is more accurate than one or the other alone.
Great, thank you. And last question from Ayed. Are there publicly available plugins for the chymograph method?
Not that I'm aware of. It's actually not hard to do, because it's just a matter of saving a line and then projecting it as an image. So the code behind it is somewhat simple. So it's even possible that you might be able to find, you know, pre-written code on any kind of forums that are looking into it. I'm not aware of something publicly free and already written, but it's not exactly hard to pursue.
Thank you. And currently we have no more questions from the audience. Then maybe we can go to our questions, Katie.
Yep. I actually have one about this double beat that you showed on one of the last videos. Is that something you can pick up with the FFT?
So remember that the FFT does not show any kind of pattern. So, you know, it's like if you pause, then it means that overall your beat is slower, and so your FFT will be decreased. Now, if you do somewhat of a half beat and then come back and then do a full beat, I'm pretty sure that your FFT won't pick that up, because a half beat will be still a beat, and so you will see somewhat of two frequency in your parameter, which will be like, you know, the full beat will give you one frequency, the half beat will give you maybe a, you know, somewhat of another frequency, and so the frequency total that you will pick up will be somewhat of a mix of both. So you might have a more blurry signal, but I don't know how much you would be able to quantify that.
Okay, thank you.
One question from me, Mathieu. Where do you see there's a need for further improvement for the quality of the diagnosis with high-speed video microscopy? For example, do you think the cilia from ciliogenesis is good enough? Do you need to change medium, or do you need better cameras of software for better diagnosis?
I think at this point, and I just speak in my own opinion, most people that say that high-speed video microscopy is not good enough for giving any useful information for diagnosis base this idea on poorly recorded video. And so if you record single cells and you record them with somewhat of a too small of a magnification and somewhat of a too slow frame rate, well, it's fair that you won't be able to see anything outside of it's beating, it's not beating. But if we get back to Bruna, Rubo, and Amelia's paper from 2019, I think it's pretty clear that high-speed video microscopy is actually useful for PCD diagnosis. I mean, 100% sensitivity, 96% specificity. I think it's pretty clear that this is useful, but it's useful if it's done well. And I don't think that at this point, the guidelines need to be on a better way to record more than a better way to analyze.
Thank you. Wait, another question from Ayed. For the FPS, it seems like most are in agreement that around 100 FPS is sufficient. What is the rationale for 500 FPS? Clinically, do you think that 500 FPS will be needed for the CC mutations, which are more tricky to assess? Very good question.
So, you know, it's like, it's just a matter of how many image do you have per bit and what do you want to see. If you just want a crude description of your cilia and you are interested in, let's say, ciliary bit frequency only, 100 frames per second will give you, you know, 15, 20 image per cilia. You will see the cilia moving. You will get somewhat of an idea on how it's moving. You will get a frequency. With 100 frames per second, you can detect frequency up to 50 hertz. So I wouldn't say it's bad, but then if you want to actually be able to play frame by frame, either for like a visual assessment or for a quantitative approach, you will need more more image than 10 image, because if you have 10 image, what does it mean? You have like 5, 6 different image to describe the whole cycle from the end to the from the start to the end of the forward motion. I don't think it's enough to have an accurate description. Yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you. Then another question from me. Regarding machine learning, do you think with the current state of high-speed video microscopy, it is already fit for machine learning, or what further steps does it need to go to that direction?
So, I mean, we saw this paper from, and I will butcher his name again, I'm so sorry, Chakrash and Toba something, from 2015, which was already some kind of approach of machine learning and automatic detection of ciliary beat characteristic. And we even have, like, you know, it's like there's this like really cool paper and work that was published by Andrea Pinto a couple weeks or months ago about machine learning and TEM. And I think now the machine learnings are powerful enough that we could definitely get to a point where we could feed videos to a machine that will say PCD, non-PCD. But once again, like, what does the machine give you? Because if you are a human and you look at it, if it's beating or not beating, you get pretty quick the same assessment. The question is how a machine and any kind of AI can actually pick the subtle change in some of the genotype. And I think we are close to it. And there will be work probably soon on trying to do that. And maybe, you know, in 10 years, we might have, like, you know, everybody will just use the same software because someone will have found it. I don't think we are there yet, but I think we are on the right direction.
Thanks a lot, Mathieu. So I think we don't have any questions right now. Katie, would you like to introduce the Padlet?
Sure. So thanks again, Mathieu, for an absolutely fantastic lecture. I have a Padlet link, which I'm going to share now.